In this video we will cover assumptions and why it is best to avoid them when taking the verbal reasoning subtest. Assumptions aren't inherently a bad thing, we make assumptions all the time, but when you are being tested we need to be able to distinguish between what is explicitly proven by a given text or what is simply our own assumption. Our objectives over the next few minutes are to define what an assumption is, show how assumptions can be exploited in the verbal reasoning subtest, and to demonstrate how to avoid making such assumptions. Before we get to a question, let us first be clear about what an assumption is. An assumption is a belief that has not been proven but which you are relying on to draw a conclusion. For example, can you find the assumption in the following set of statements? Disease A causes symptom X. Patient P has symptom X, therefore patient P has disease A. The assumption is that only disease A causes symptom X and that nothing else could have caused symptom X to present in patient P. This may be true, but it is not proven. It is an assumption. As it may be a false assumption, the conclusion may be incorrect. The message is this: don't pick the answer you think is probably or plausibly true. Pick the answer that is provably true based on the text. We're going to give you 2.5 minutes to answer the following 4 questions, which roughly works out 38 seconds per question. This is slightly generous, but it is a realistic time frame for the test, given that we are aiming to complete true, false, or can't tell questions in approximately 5 to 10 seconds, and that we may need to skip a question set at some point. Question 1. One conclusion that can be drawn from the text is that A. An accident and emergency department in a developed country hospital will use software to conduct triage. B. Those who are deemed unlikely to live under any circumstances by French doctors in World War I were generally not given treatment. C. The location at which a patient is treated is sometimes decided through triage. And D. Triage is usually based on a patient's age and the location of the injury. For question 1, the answer is option C. The location at which a patient is treated is sometimes decided through triage. All the other answers rely on some form of assumption. This answer relies on a direct quote from the text, where at the end of the first paragraph it says, triage may result in determining the order and priority of emergency treatment, the order and priority of emergency transport, or the transport destination for the patient. For the other answers, option A states that accident and emergency department in a developed country hospital will use software to conduct triage. This is a reasonable assumption, but it is not stated in the text. We know nothing from the text about procedures in a developed country. Option B said that those who are deemed unlikely to live under any circumstances by French doctors in World War I were generally not given treatment. We only know from the text that wounded soldiers were categorised using triage, not that those deemed unlikely to live were not given treatment. Though you might assume they were not given treatment, you cannot prove it from the text. Finally, option D states that triage is usually based on a patient's age and the location of the injury. Again, this is an assumption based on common sense, but it isn't proven by the text. We are never actually told that triage is based on the age of the patient or the location of the injury. Instead, triage is based on the severity of the patient's condition. Question 2. Triage is intended to A. Treat the greatest number of patients, B. Respond to a mass casualty incident in the quickest possible time, C. Efficiently allocate the medical resources available, or D. Alleviate the suffering of those most in pain. For question 2, the answer is option C. Efficiently allocate the medical resources available. We have a quote to support this. The second sentence in the passage states that triage rations patient treatment efficiently when resources are insufficient for all to be treated immediately. While the other answers may seem tempting, they are based on assumptions, not evident from the text. Let's quickly check each in turn to be sure. Option A states that triage intends to treat the greatest number of patients. While we can assume that every clinician will surely want to alleviate the suffering of the greatest number of patients, the passage does not state this as the intention of triage. Triage is about deciding which patients most need the medical resources available, rather than maximising how many patients are treated. Option B is that triage intends to respond to a mass casualty incident in the quickest possible time. Again, this is a reasonable general assumption, but not an answer to the question. Triage is not intended to reduce the time taken to respond to a mass casualty incident. It's intended to systematise who needs treatment most urgently. Option D was to alleviate the suffering of those most in pain. Many students might have picked this answer, but it is based on a subtle assumption. Triage is not about pain per se, but about the severity of the condition. Do you see the difference? You might have assumed pain correlates to the severity of a patient's condition, but that's just an assumption. A critically unwell patient might be in less pain but in more need of urgent medical attention than another patient with severe but not life-threatening injuries next to them. Question 3. Which of the following can be inferred from the passage? A. The initial assessment of the injured individual will be conducted by the most senior clinician. B. Doctors can specialise in treating mass casualty incident patients. C. A triage tag will display a patient's chances of dying. D. Triage is often based on a scoring system. For question 3, the answer is option D, that triage is often based on a scoring system. We have a quote to support this answer from the third paragraph of the passage. The categorizations of the victims are frequently the result of triage scores. For the other answers, option A, the initial assessment of the injured individual will be conducted by the most senior clinician. This is an assumption. This may be the case, or perhaps the most senior clinician is treating other patients and a less senior clinician is conducting triage. The passage does not state either way. Option B, doctors can specialise in treating mass casualty incident patients. Nowhere in the text is specialising or the concept of doctors working in just this field mentioned. Option C, a triage tag will display a patient's chances of dying. The text states that a triage tag might identify the patient, display assessment findings, and identify the priority of the patient's need for medical treatment, but we are never told that it would display the patient's chances of dying. Question 4. Using the information in the text, the following statements about triage are true except A. Triage was invented by the French. B. Triage tags are printed in advance of when they will be used. C. Triage decides the order in which emergency transport is allocated. And D. Triage is based on an acknowledgement that sometimes the resources available are not sufficient to treat every patient with equal priority. For question 4, the answer is option A, that triage was invented by the French. Did you spot that this was an except question? In other words, one answer will be false and all the other 3 answers will be true. The answer, triage was invented by the French, is false. While the word triage is French in origin, and while the text states that triage may have originated in the Napoleonic Wars and been used by French doctors in World War I, it is never unambiguously stated as having been invented by the French. For the other answers, option B, triage tags are printed in advance of when they will be used. We are told that triage tags are pre-printed, meaning that they are indeed printed in advance of an incident. Option C, triage decides the order in which emergency transport is allocated. This can be proven with a direct quote from the end of the first paragraph, which states that triage may result in determining the order and priority of emergency transport. And finally, option D. Triage is based on an acknowledgement that sometimes the resources available are not sufficient to treat every patient with equal priority. This is the underlying premise of the whole text. If every patient could be treated with equal priority, triage would not be needed. We hope that this video has shown you how and why to avoid making assumptions in your answers. It is a good principle to always test your assumptions, and this advice is equally relevant to verbal reasoning. While assumptions can be handy shortcuts in the real world, it is good to be aware of when you are making them, and to be aware that in a test like the UCAT, assumptions can be a big hindrance. Practice avoiding them.
That concludes another UCAT lesson. If you like the strategies and content we're developing and want to see more free content, please leave us a like and don't forget to subscribe. If you have any UCAT questions, leave us a comment below and we'll help you sort it out and get your preparation up to speed.